on that road. And these ambulances will sometimes wait for hours before reaching the checkpoints themselves. And when they get there, they're oftentimes not sort of rushed through quickly, but actually held at gunpoint, as you can see in this photograph, while another soldier will go around the back to sort of screen through the back of the ambulance. And the reasoning given for holding up ambulances oftentimes even longer than average civilian vehicles is that apparently in the past these ambulances have been used to transport weapons or people wanted by the Israeli government. I've done a little research on the subject and discovered that actually there is one documented case of a Palestinian ambulance being abused for these purposes. But even if they were being used for these purposes, even if that was the case, remember that this Palestinian ambulance is traveling from a Palestinian village to a Palestinian city. It's not traveling from the West Bank into Israel, and that is where these checkpoints are located, between Palestinian built-up areas, such that in what way is holding up this ambulance endangering the lives of the people in back of it? In what way is this contributing to the safety or the security of the Israeli population, let alone the entire Palestinian population? This is the checkpoint outside of the village of Deir Balut where I spent some time, and this checkpoint is open from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. What that means is that if you have any kind of an emergency between the hours of 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., well, you're kind of out of luck. And in fact, what happened was that a woman from the village who was 7 months pregnant with twins began to have contractions at 1 o'clock in the morning. Her husband drove her frantically to the checkpoint, which they needed to cross to reach the nearest hospital in the city of Ramallah, an hour away. They got to the checkpoint, and the soldiers who sleep above it came down to meet them and were very polite. And they said, look, the rule is very clear. Palestinians are not allowed through until 7 in the morning. Please come back at 7. Well, the woman obviously couldn't wait 6 hours to have her babies, and so they argued a bit more. And the soldiers, again, they were very polite and even apologetic, and they just kept saying the same thing over and over again. They said, look, we didn't make the rules. We don't even agree with them. We're just following orders. We're just following orders. This is something I hear from soldiers almost daily. We're just following orders, and that's exactly what the soldiers were doing. At that point, the husband decided to call an ambulance to come from Ramallah City, an hour away, to the checkpoint, so that all it would take would be for his wife to walk by foot from her own vehicle across the checkpoint to the ambulance. Ambulance arrives an hour later, and the soldiers come down shaking their heads, and they say, look, it doesn't matter if you're going by foot or by car, you're still Palestinian, it's still the middle of the night, you still can't cross. At that point, they're sort of tearing their hair out, and the husband decides to call all of his friends, and he, like many Palestinians, had actually worked in Israel, speaks Hebrew, and was able to contact an Israeli friend that had a connection to the army that was high enough such that they were able to get this woman permission to cross the checkpoint and to get to the hospital. The soldiers allowed her through. They wouldn't allow her husband to go with her. She got to the ambulance and immediately began to give birth to the twins. And the twins were born, both of them alive, and basically healthy, except, of course, that they were 2 months premature. And because they were premature, they were in desperate need of hospital attention. And because they were an hour away on a bumpy road in the middle of the night, having waited almost 2 hours at the checkpoint, they weren't able to reach the hospital in time. And because of this, both of this woman's babies died. And I tell this story not because it's heartbreaking and not because I'm trying to demonize these soldiers. Look, I believe in the Nuremberg principles, that people are responsible for their actions even if they are following orders. That said, what I think is the greatest crime of all is not so much the acts of the individual soldiers who might be nicer or meaner, but the system itself. The fact that things are structured this way such that there are even soldiers there to begin with who control whether or not a person can go to the hospital. That to me is the greatest crime. Like I said, this is the checkpoint outside of the village of Deir Balut. The village itself is sort of over to the left of the photograph, and there is a direct road from the village to the checkpoint, but villagers aren't allowed to use it. And that's because there's something called roadblocks on it. And roadblocks are, like you see here, often concrete cubes placed on Palestinian roads to prevent Palestinians from being able to use their vehicles on their roads. So what these roadblocks mean, for example, for the village of Deir Balut, is that instead of taking a half-mile paved road from their village to the checkpoint every morning on their way to work or to school, they have to take a 3-mile unpaved detour all the way around through the countryside to reach the exact same spot. What does this mean for them? More time, more stress, more wear and tear on their vehicles, more money for gas. And again, this question of security, right? These institutions, the checkpoints, the roadblocks, are supposed to be there for the security and safety of the Israeli population, to prevent terrorism. In what way are these roadblocks securing anybody? Forcing Palestinians to take this long detour. How much is this about security, and how much is this about control? Some roadblocks are made with dirt, and you can see these villagers on the right here are coming home from work. They live on the other side of the roadblock, so what they have to do every morning is that they drive their cars to the roadblocks, park them, walk around by foot, and take a taxi the rest of the way to work or to school, and repeat the process coming home. So these roadblocks prevent something as basic as Palestinians taking their vehicles from their house to their work or to school. And finally, these roadblocks are extremely disabling to the Palestinian economy. As you can imagine, transporting goods from one end of the land to the other is not a trivial process given all of these checkpoints and roadblocks. So basically, a truck that's carrying Palestinian goods, when it reaches a roadblock, has to sort of turn around and back up against the roadblocks, get another vehicle to come from the other end and turn around and back up from that end. And somebody has to actually manually transport these goods from one end of the roadblock to the other, as you see in these photographs. And, well, the products are not always office equipment. They could be produce, perishables, things that go bad by the time they reach their destination. And they could be desperately needed medical supplies. Beyond just taking a long time, this whole process renders a lot of these Palestinian products much more expensive than they otherwise would be because of the extra manpower and vehicular power that's required to transport them. What happens then is that a lot of these Palestinian products end up being even more expensive than their Israeli counterparts, which are very easy to transport on the Israeli-only roads. What happens then, of course, is that the Palestinian market is then flooded with Israeli products, which Palestinians, many of them struggling to make ends meet, end up purchasing instead of supporting their own economy, supporting the very country that is occupying them. Settlements are the next part of my talk. Settlements in the territories are essentially communities of Jewish Israelis who are living on Palestinian land. And they may be sort of villages, towns, cities. Here's a rather large one near Bethlehem in Jerusalem. And again, all of this land here is Palestinian land. It belongs to the Palestinians. It's internationally recognized as Palestinian land. And yet there's this city that's been built on top of it that is exclusively for Jewish Israelis. Well, what does this mean? Who gets to live in that city? Well, I could live in that city, right? Because I'm Jewish. I would just have to fill out an application. I could move there next week if I wanted to. And yet the farmers, the Palestinians that own the land that the city was built on, aren't allowed to live in it. Now, this process is nothing new. It's happened throughout history, all over the world, and there's a name for it. It's called colonization. And it's interesting that in English and in Hebrew we have this kind of benign word, settlements, whereas in many languages, like French, for example, these settlements are called colonies, and that's exactly what they are. And they are illegal, according to international law, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring citizens from its own territory to the occupied territory, which is exactly what Israel's doing. Instead of working against the system, though, Israel actually promotes it, as you can see in this photograph, which shows a billboard on an Israeli-only road in the Palestinian territories, and it basically says, it's in Hebrew, it says, "Now more than ever," and underneath it says, basically, if you come to our community, to Ariel, which is a settlement, if you come to live in Ariel, you will be rewarded with 100,000 Israeli shekels. That's more than 20,000 US dollars. In other words, the Israeli government is actually paying its own citizens to move from Israel proper to the occupied territories to become part of the illegal occupying population. And what's particularly interesting to me about this billboard is who is it targeting? Who are going to be the Israelis who uproot their families to go live on this foreign land because it's cheaper to do so? Is it going to be well-off, wealthy, established Israeli families? No, they want to live in Tel Aviv. The families who end up taking advantage of these offers are going to be low-income Israelis, poor Israelis, recent immigrants from Africa, from Eastern Europe. And in fact, a lot of these settlements, Ariel included, are populated primarily by immigrants who've moved to the territories, not because they say this land is ours and nobody else's, but because they're looking for a higher standard of living. And these financial offers can be very appealing. People who take advantage of them will get nice housing, oftentimes with mortgages subsidized by the government. There are parks for their kids to play in, strip malls, swimming pools, and a place where water is so precious. A nice offer, right? Again, all of this built illegally on Palestinian land. At this point, there are settlements all over the West Bank. The red dots in this map indicate where you have an illegal Jewish-only colony built on Palestinian land. And of course, coming along with the settlements and colonies is the road network. And here you can see it's just a handful of them, but the way those blue roads and highways really chop up, compartmentalize that Palestinian landscape. Remember, of course, that these roads were built illegally on Palestinian land, and that the Palestinians owning the land that they were built on, for the most part, aren't even allowed to use them because of the segregated road system. The next part of my talk is on outposts, which are similar to settlements in that they are incidents of Jewish Israelis living illegally on Palestinian land. One of the main differences are the people who choose to live in these outposts. So I talked before about what I call economic settlers, moving to the territories for financial benefits. And they represent about 80% of the settler population, a vast majority that says, according to polls, that they would be willing to leave if they were offered financial compensation. So when Israel says it's impossible to make all of these hundreds of thousands of settlers leave, remember that the vast majority are there simply because the government is paying them to do so. The remaining 20% of the settler population are often called ideological settlers, moving to the territories not for money, but because of their beliefs. And many of them believe that the land in the West Bank and Gaza belongs to the Jewish people, for oftentimes religious reasons or maybe political reasons. And according to many of these people, the Palestinians are the ones who are occupying this land, Jewish land. And so they will actually come in the middle of the night with trailers and simply establish themselves on a plot of Palestinian land and say, we're not leaving, this land belongs to us. Well, a farmer wakes up the next morning and there's an outpost on his land, and while the Israeli government says that it doesn't condone this kind of practice, it doesn't do a whole lot to prevent the settlers from coming or to make them leave. And so over time, these outposts begin to grow. More settlers move into them. Eventually they want a school for their children. They want a fence around them for security. They want a road to connect them to Israel. And over time what you have is it's no longer an outpost. It's a new settlement. And that's the way a lot of these settlements were originally founded and grew into what they are today. And once they become settlements and recognized by the Israeli government as such, they become subsidized by the Israeli government, which means subsidized by the U.S. government, by us. The U.S. government gives Israel between 3 and 5 billion American tax dollars every year. That's more than $10 million every single day. That is going towards upholding these illegal practices. And, this may seem like something kind of on the other side of the world, has nothing to do with us as Americans, but we are the ones paying for this. We have a right, we have a responsibility to know where our tax dollars are going and to ensure that they are not being used to violate human rights, international law, and even U.S. law. Here's a few pictures of outposts. This one is above the village of Yanun, and oftentimes they're placed on hilltops for sort of strategic reasons. Here's the village of Yanun, a Palestinian village of about 300 people. Here's one of the homes in the village, and again you can see up top there the outpost. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the settlers living in these outposts don't really think the Palestinians have any right to be where they are. And so they'll actually come down with large weapons even to try and threaten the villagers, to try to make them leave their homes and land. And here's a picture of one of these armed settlers that's come down to threaten a villager picking her olives. In the past, these settlers have beaten up numerous villagers. They've poked a young boy's eye out of his face. They've beaten an old woman with her walking stick. They've killed a villager. They've stolen olives. Keep in mind, of course, that Palestinians in this part of the world are not allowed to have any kind